Welcome to Truth Unraveled, where hidden stories come to light. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next untold truth. The city was alive with neon lights, laughter spilling from crowded bars, and the endless hum of traffic. To most, it was just another Friday night. But for Jack Miller, it was a battlefield of its own kind. One where survival meant finding warmth under a bridge, scrounging for leftovers in trash bins, and guarding the last remnants of dignity from being stripped away. Jack wasn't always invisible. Once he had worn the uniform of the United States Army with pride. He had marched in formation, carried the flag on his shoulder, and believed every word when his commanding officer said, "You are serving your country. You matter." But wars don't end when the guns go silent. For Jack, the real battle began when he came home. Jack had served 2 tours overseas. He had seen things no man should have to see: the loss of brothers in arms, the look of fear in civilians' eyes, the endless sand that swallowed both hope and humanity. When his deployment ended, he stepped off the plane expecting gratitude, opportunity, maybe even a fresh start. Instead, he was met with silence. The medals pinned to his chest meant little to employers who saw only gaps in his resume. His nightmares, screams, explosions, the suffocating smell of smoke cost him his marriage. His wife, tired of waking to his cries and unable to shoulder the weight of his invisible wounds, left. Soon after, bills piled up, and the bank claimed their house. Jack drifted. From couch to couch, shelter to shelter, until finally there was nowhere left. The streets became his address. To the city, he was just another homeless man, unshaven, weather-beaten, wrapped in layers of thrift store jackets. Strangers walked past without meeting his eyes, clutching their purses tighter, quickening their steps. But inside Jack's worn-out backpack, tucked in a weatherproof sleeve, was his most treasured possession: a folded letter. The ink had faded over the years, but every word was etched in his memory. It was from his best friend and fellow soldier Mike, who hadn't made it back from their last mission. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. But Jack, don't let the world forget who you are. You're a fighter, and fighters don't quit. Live, brother. For both of us." Jack read that letter almost every night. It was the only thing that reminded him he had once mattered, that somewhere, someone believed in him. On cold nights, he would sit by the fire barrels under the overpass with other forgotten men, veterans like him. Men who had given their youth to wars their country barely remembered. Some numbed their pain with cheap liquor, others with drugs. Jack tried to cling to silence, to the memory of Mike's words. Yet silence was cruel. It amplified the city's indifference. One evening, as Jack sat near the bus stop, people watching to distract himself from hunger, a group of teenagers passed by. One of them sneered, tossing a crumpled soda cup in his direction. "Get a job, loser," the boy muttered. Jack said nothing. He was used to it, but the words still cut, sharper than shrapnel. He wanted to scream. "I had a job. I served. I bled for you. For all of you." But he stayed silent, clutching the strap of his backpack, his fingers tracing the outline of Mike's letter inside. There were moments when Jack wondered if Mike had been wrong. Maybe fighters did quit, eventually. Maybe some battles weren't meant to be won. But life, as it often does, had other plans. One cold December night, as snow began to fall and the streets grew quieter, Jack's fate started to shift. He didn't know it yet, but the universe was aligning in a way that would test every ounce of courage he had left. For now, though, he was just a man, tired, forgotten, sitting on a park bench, shivering under a broken street lamp. The world had turned its back on him. But soon the same world would witness a moment so extraordinary, it would remind everyone that even though society discards can rise as heroes when it matters most. Jack woke up to the sound of a city already rushing past him. The bench beneath him was cold, the thin blanket over his shoulders damp with last night's snow. Around him, commuters hurried in polished shoes and pressed coats, their faces buried in phones, coffee cups warming their hands. To them, he was invisible. Jack stretched, joints aching, and sat up slowly. A police officer strolled by, giving him a look that was half warning, half pity. Jack knew what it meant. Move along. Always move along. Homelessness had its own unspoken laws, Don't linger, don't make people uncomfortable, don't exist too loudly. He folded the blanket, tucked it into his backpack, and walked toward the soup kitchen 3 blocks away. The icy wind whipped at his face, but he pressed on. Hunger was worse than the cold. At the shelter, the line stretched around the corner. Men and women stood silently, eyes downcast, waiting for a hot meal. Jack joined them, familiar with the routine. Inside, a volunteer ladled stew into a styrofoam bowl and handed it to him with a polite but distant smile. Jack muttered a thank you and carried it to a table. The stew was watery, but it was food. Jack ate slowly, savoring every bite, trying to make it last. Around him, conversations buzzed, fragments of stories about lost jobs, broken families, addictions, stories of people society no longer wanted to hear. Jack rarely spoke. He preferred listening. Later, he wandered back into the streets. He had no destination, just the city itself as his endless backdrop. Sometimes he'd linger outside bookstores, staring at shelves through the glass, remembering how he used to love reading history and biographies. He had once dreamed of becoming a teacher after the military. That dream now felt like it belonged to another man, a stranger. At night, he sought out the familiar group under the overpass. They weren't friends exactly, but they understood one another. "Cold one tonight," muttered Ron, a fellow vet, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. Jack nodded. "Colder tomorrow." The men laughed softly, an acknowledgement of survival. Each day they made it through was a small victory. But Jack carried something the others didn't, that letter from Mike. He kept it hidden, almost sacred. Sometimes Ron would ask, "What keeps you going, Jack?" Jack would shrug. He never showed the letter. Some things were too personal, too fragile to share. Despite the harshness, Jack still found moments of grace. A young woman once stopped to hand him a coffee on her way to work, her eyes meeting his with genuine kindness. "Stay warm, sir," she said softly. It wasn't much, a paper cup, a fleeting moment, but to Jack, it was a reminder that not everyone had forgotten him. Still, these moments were rare. Most days brought only silence or disdain. People crossed the street to avoid him. Parents pulled their children closer. He was the other, the cautionary tale no one wanted to acknowledge. Winter grew harsher. One night, Jack tried to sleep by the subway vent for warmth, but a security guard kicked him awake, threatening arrest. He moved along, as always. By dawn, frost clung to his beard, his fingers numb. He sat on a bench, too exhausted to move. In those dark hours, despair whispered louder than Mike's words ever could. "What's the point?" Jack stared at the folded letter in his hand. He unfolded it carefully, reading the faded lines for the 100th time. "Don't let the world forget who you are. You're a fighter, and fighters don't quit." Jack inhaled sharply. He tucked the letter back, clenched his fists, and pushed himself upright. He wasn't sure why he kept going, but he did. It was during one of these aimless wanderings that Jack found himself in the wealthy part of town. Mansions with manicured lawns, luxury cars parked in driveways, everything a stark contrast to the crumbling concrete of his world. He had no reason to be there, except maybe curiosity or the faint memory of what stability once felt like. As he walked past one particularly grand estate, he paused. Children's laughter rang out from the backyard. For a fleeting second, he imagined himself as the father he once had been, tossing a football, grilling burgers, smiling without the weight of war on his shoulders. The memory stung. He turned to leave, but fate had other plans. From behind the tall iron gates, a sudden scream pierced the air. A child's voice, high and panicked. Then chaos, the sound of splashing, frantic cries for help. Jack froze, instincts kicking in before thought could catch up. He scanned the yard. Beyond the hedges, he caught sight of a small figure thrashing in the pool. The screams grew louder. The child was drowning. And in that split second, Jack, the forgotten soldier, the invisible man, knew exactly what he had to do. Thomas sat huddled under his threadbare blanket, breath fogging in the bitter night air. The underpass above groaned whenever a truck rumbled past, and the cold concrete beneath him seemed to leach away what little warmth his body still carried. To the city, he was invisible. Just another homeless veteran among countless others, surviving from meal to meal, night to night. But inside his chest lived memories far louder than the noise of passing cars. They came uninvited, dragging him back to deserts where the sun was merciless, and nights where silence was broken only by gunfire. He had been a soldier once, disciplined, strong, reliable. Now he was a shadow of that man, discarded by a society that had long moved on. Tonight, however, something felt different. Footsteps echoed down the slope leading under the bridge, steady, deliberate, not the hurried shuffling of another homeless soul seeking shelter. Thomas straightened instinctively, the reflex of a soldier never fully gone. From the shadows emerged a tall man in a dark overcoat, his polished shoes out of place on the filthy concrete. He stopped a few feet away. "Are you Thomas Miller?" Thomas blinked. It had been years since anyone spoke his full name. Usually he was old man, vet, or sometimes worse. He squinted at the stranger. Depends who's asking. The man lowered himself onto the cold ground, ignoring the dirt that would stain his expensive coat. His eyes, sharp yet strangely gentle, locked on Thomas's. "My name is Richard Carter," he said. "I'm the chairman of Carter Industries." Thomas gave a rough laugh. He'd heard that name before, on the battered radio at the shelter, in newspapers blowing down alleys. Carter Industries was a corporate giant, but what business would a man like this have with him? "You're lost, friend," Thomas muttered, pulling his blanket tighter. "I don't know you." Richard shook his head slowly. "No, but I know you, and I've been searching for you for 20 years. Thomas frowned. "You've got the wrong man." "You saved a boy once," Richard continued, voice steady but thick with emotion. "By the Hudson River. He'd slipped into the current. You dove in without hesitation." The memory hit Thomas like a thunderclap. He could almost feel the icy water closing around him again, hear the desperate splashing of small arms flailing against the tide. He remembered the panic, the raw instinct to leap before thinking. His muscles had burned as he fought the current, his lungs screamed for air, but somehow he'd hauled the child to safety. He had pressed the shivering boy into his parents' arms, and before gratitude could be spoken, he disappeared into the crowd, unwilling to linger in a world that no longer felt his. Now, decades later, that moment came rushing back, vivid as though it had happened yesterday. Richard's eyes glistened. "That boy was my son, Andrew. He's alive today because of you." Thomas's throat tightened. For years he had dismissed that day as nothing more than instinct, a fleeting act swallowed by the endless march of his broken life. To hear now that the boy had not only survived but thrived because of him, it was almost unbearable. You're mistaken," Thomas whispered hoarsely. "I was no hero, just a man who happened to be there." "No," Richard said firmly, his voice echoing under the bridge. "Others were there too. They watched. Only you jumped. That makes you more than a man passing by. That makes you the reason I didn't bury my son that day." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Thomas looked down at his calloused hands, scarred and trembling. Once, those hands had carried rifles, built barricades, saved brothers in arms. Now they could barely hold a cup of soup without shaking. "Hero," he muttered bitterly. "Look at me. I couldn't save my own life, couldn't save my family, my future. I've got nothing." Richard leaned forward, intensity burning in his gaze. "You gave me everything. You gave me my child. That's not nothing. That's everything." Thomas's eyes brimmed despite his effort to hold back. For so long he had been unseen, unacknowledged, just another forgotten soul. And now, here was one of the most powerful men in America, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, speaking as though Thomas's existence had meant the world. "Why now?" Thomas asked quietly. "Why come looking after all these years?" Richard's voice cracked. "Because my son never forgot. Andrew remembers your face, your voice, the strength of your arms pulling him from death. He made me promise that if we ever found you, we would thank you. Not just with words, but with a chance to reclaim the dignity this world stole from you." Thomas swallowed hard. A chance. The word sounded foreign to him, like a relic from a language he no longer spoke. Could there really be such a thing left for him? For the first time in years, he felt something stir deep within, a spark buried under layers of despair. Hope. Fragile, trembling, but alive. Richard extended his hand. Let me honor what you did. Let me give you back the life you deserve. Thomas stared at that hand for a long moment. His heart pounded. He had spent so many years hiding, punishing himself, convinced he was beyond saving. And yet, here was redemption, reaching toward him. Finally, with a shaky breath, he placed his scarred, weathered hand into Richard Carter's firm grip. And in that simple gesture, Thomas realized that the act he once dismissed as insignificant had come full circle. The life he thought wasted now carried meaning he could never have imagined. For the first time in decades, Thomas Miller felt seen. Thomas Miller stood in a suit that felt borrowed from another man's life. The reflection in the hotel lobby's polished glass startled him every time. The hunched veteran in rags had vanished, replaced by someone almost unrecognizable. His hair was trimmed, his beard gone, his shoulders squared with tentative dignity. But inside, he was anything but steady. Tonight wasn't just a reunion. It was a reckoning. Richard Carter had insisted Thomas attend a gala hosted by Carter Industries. You'll see, Richard had promised. It's time the world knows who you are. The thought terrified Thomas. For decades, he had existed in the margins, unseen, unwanted. Now he was about to step into a hall glowing with chandeliers, filled with men, and women in glittering gowns and tailored suits, people who had never known hunger, let alone the brutality of a war zone. And yet, here he was. The doors opened, and a hush rippled through the crowd as Richard Carter entered, followed closely by his son Andrew. Cameras flashed, journalists whispered, then Richard gestured and Thomas stepped into the light. For a split second, silence hung heavy, pierced only by the clink of a dropped glass. To the glittering elite of New York City, Thomas looked like an intruder. They saw his scars, the stiffness in his gait, the unease of a man out of place. Some whispered. Others scoffed. Thomas felt the weight of their stares like bullets. The old shame roared back, urging him to flee. But Richard's hand on his shoulder anchored him. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard announced, voice steady and commanding, this is Thomas Miller, the man who saved my son's life 20 years ago. Without him, Andrew Carter would not be standing here today. Without him, my family's story would have ended in tragedy. Tonight, we honor him. Gasps spread across the hall. Faces softened, but not all. At a table near the stage, a group of investors exchanged sharp glances. One of them, a sleek man named Douglas Reed, leaned back with a sneer. So this is your hero? A homeless vagrant plucked off the street? Richard, you're sentimental to a fault. Thomas's jaw tightened. The words sliced deeper than any battlefield wound. But before he could retreat into silence, Andrew stepped forward, his young face glowing with gratitude. Mr. Miller, he said, voice carrying across the hall. You may have forgotten that day by the river, but I never did. Your courage shaped my life, and it's because of you that I pursued innovation to give back to those who are unseen, like you once were. He gestured toward a sleek prototype displayed behind him, a compact, portable water purifier designed for disaster zones and homeless communities. This invention, Andrew continued, was inspired by the memory of a man who risked everything for a stranger. Tonight, I'm proud to say we are launching the Carter Foundation for Veterans and the Homeless, and Thomas Miller will lead it. The room erupted in murmurs, shock, disbelief, and awe colliding. Thomas's knees nearly buckled. Let it? Him? The homeless veteran who had spent years scavenging for scraps? Douglas Reed scoffed again. This is absurd. A charity run by a beggar? Investors will flee. The press will laugh. A hot flush burned Thomas's cheeks. He wanted to disappear. But then Richard spoke, his voice like iron. Enough, Douglas. This man has endured more than any of us here. He's faced bullets, hunger, and the cold indifference of a society that should have stood by him. If he can survive all that, he can lead with strength none of you will ever know. The applause began hesitantly, then swelled until the chandeliers trembled with the force of it. Thomas, blinking against tears, felt the wave of sound lift him higher than he had ever stood. For the first time, the world wasn't mocking him. The world was listening. But the climax wasn't applause. It was the choice laid bare before him. He could step forward, accept the role, and risk failing in front of everyone. Or he could retreat back into the shadows where anonymity was safe, where no one could ever mock him again. Richard turned to him. Andrew's hopeful eyes shone. The crowd waited. Thomas's heart pounded like the drums of war. Memories of nights beneath bridges, of veterans he'd lost along the way, of every whispered insult, worthless, broken, forgotten, all thundered inside him. And then he remembered the boy gasping for breath in his arms, the promise of life carried forward. Slowly, he stepped to the microphone. His voice shook, but his words rang clear. "I don't know if I deserve this," he began. "For years I believed my story was over, that I was nothing but a shadow. But tonight I see that even the smallest act can ripple for decades. I saved a boy once. Now maybe I can save many more. Not with weapons, but with purpose. If you'll have me, I'll lead." The hall exploded in thunderous applause. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others stood to their feet. And in that moment, Thomas Miller, once ignored, once forgotten, was reborn before the world's eyes. David had always believed that silence was easier than remembrance. Silence kept the nightmares buried, the gunfire muted, and the memories of lost brothers locked away where no one could reach them. But the moment the press found out that the homeless man who had saved the life of Richard Hale's son was a decorated veteran, silence was no longer an option. Overnight, headlines appeared in bold black letters. "Homeless veteran saves billionaire's son. Forgotten soldier becomes unexpected hero." Paparazzi photographs of David appeared everywhere. Him stepping out of a temporary shelter, him walking alongside Richard, him sitting awkwardly in Ethan's hospital room. For a man who had lived years in the shadows, it felt like being dragged under a blinding spotlight. The first wave of attention wasn't kind. Online comments poured in. "Where was he when other kids needed saving? He's just after money. Don't romanticize bums who didn't get their lives together." David read the words only once, but they seared into him like shrapnel. It was as if the world refused to see past his torn jacket and unkempt beard. He wasn't a hero to them. He was a headline, a spectacle, a man whose worth began and ended with the drama of his rescue. Richard noticed his silence. One evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Richard walked David to the hospital courtyard. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, mixed with the earthy fragrance of rain. "You saved my boy," Richard said softly. "But I can see this. Attention is hurting you." David shook his head. "It's not about me. The kid's alive. That's what matters." Richard studied him. "I've built my life around controlling stories, how the public sees my company, my family, even myself. But I can't control yours. Only you can decide what people see. You can hide, or you can show them who you really are." For days, David wrestled with the choice. Hiding was easy. But then Ethan, frail yet stubborn, surprised him one morning. "Mr. David," the boy whispered, his voice weak but determined. "Why do people say bad things about you? You saved me. Doesn't that make you a good guy?" David's throat tightened. He tried to answer, but Ethan pressed on. "Don't let them decide who you are. You told me in the hospital, heroes don't give up. Remember?" The words cut through David like light through fog. Here was a child, fighting for his life, daring him to stand tall again. So when the Hale family's communications team suggested a press conference to address the media frenzy, David, against every instinct, agreed. The day arrived cold and gray. Cameras flashed as he stepped onto the stage beside Richard and Ethan, who sat in a wheelchair but insisted on being there. For a long moment, David just stood, heart pounding, staring at the sea of expectant faces. He felt the weight of 1,000 judgments. Then he began. "My name is David Lawson. I served in the United States Army for 12 years. I fought in places most of you will never have to see, and I lost brothers I will never forget. When I came home, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. I came back with scars you couldn't see, and I didn't know how to live with them. That's how I ended up on the streets." His voice trembled, but he pushed on. "When I saw Ethan in danger that night, I didn't think. I just acted. Not because I wanted fame or money or headlines, but because a boy needed saving. And because once, a long time ago, I promised myself I'd never walk away from someone who couldn't to fight for themselves." The room fell silent. No typing, no camera clicks, just silence. David glanced at Ethan, who gave him the smallest, bravest smile. "I don't want your pity," David continued. "I don't want to be a symbol. I just want you to remember that behind every person you pass on the street, there's a story you don't know. A story of battles fought, sacrifices made, and dignity that deserves to be seen." By the time he finished, the boy in the wheelchair was clapping. Then Richard joined in. Slowly, the entire room erupted in applause. For the first time in years, David didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. But the applause wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Offers of help poured in from veterans organizations, mental health advocates, and even government officials. A local newspaper published an in-depth piece titled, "The Soldier America Forgot." For once, the words weren't cruel. They were compassionate, raw, and true. Still, not everyone was convinced. A week later, David faced his harshest trial yet, not in a battlefield, not in a courtroom, but in a reunion with his estranged daughter, Sarah. She had been a child when he left for war, a teenager when he returned broken, and a young woman when he disappeared into homelessness. For years, she had thought him dead. The press coverage had reached her, and now she stood in front of him, trembling, torn between fury and longing. "You saved a stranger's son," she said, voice shaking. "But where were you when your own daughter needed saving?" The words pierced him deeper than any headline. David sank to his knees. "Sarah, I failed you. I failed your mother. I thought keeping my distance would protect you from the man I had become. But I see now it only hurt you more. I can't undo the past. But if you'll let me, I want to try." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with tears in her eyes, she whispered, "You've got a lot to make up for." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a door cracked open. And for David, that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, something remarkable began to happen. The story that started with a homeless veteran saving a boy shifted into something greater, a conversation about dignity, about unseen battles, about the debt society owed its forgotten warriors. David had gone from a shadow on the street to a man with a voice, not just for himself, but for countless others like him. And deep down, he realized something he hadn't dared to believe in years. Maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't over. Maybe it was only beginning again. The days after the press conference marked the beginning of a life David never imagined he would live again. For years, he had moved like a ghost through alleyways, shelters, and soup kitchens, his only goal being survival until the next morning. But now, people stopped him in the street, not to sneer or cast him aside, but to thank him, to shake his hand, to tell him that his courage had opened their eyes. Richard Hale kept his promise. He didn't just ensure David had a roof over his head, he gave him a purpose. The Hale Foundation announced a new initiative, the Valor Project, dedicated to helping homeless veterans reintegrate into society. At the launch, Richard made it clear where the idea had come from. "This man saved my son," Richard said, motioning to David. "But beyond that, he reminded me, and should remind us all, that no hero should be forgotten once the war is over. The Valor Project exists because of David Lawson." David wanted to disappear under the applause, but this time he stayed standing. The foundation hired him as an advisor, not just a token face for their cause, but as a man whose lived experience gave weight to every policy, every shelter built, every program funded. For the first time in years, he was no longer surviving day to day. He was building something that might outlive him. Yet even as the world applauded, the hardest battle remained deeply personal, rebuilding the fractured bond with his daughter, Sarah. Their first meeting had ended in tears and bitterness, but also in possibility. Over the following weeks, Sarah agreed to meet him again, always in small, tentative steps: coffee at a quiet cafe, a walk through a park where she used to play as a child. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they argued, and sometimes the silence between them was almost unbearable. But every meeting was a thread, fragile but real, weaving a bridge where there had once been only distance. One afternoon, as autumn leaves painted the city in red and gold, Sarah asked him the question he had dreaded. "Why didn't you come home for me, Dad? Not even once?" David swallowed hard. "Because I thought, if you saw what I'd become, you'd hate me. I thought disappearing was the only way to keep you from carrying my shame." Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "I didn't need you to be perfect. I just needed you to be there." It was then David realized the truth he had avoided all his life. The battles he thought he was fighting alone had cost more than his pride. They had cost him years with his daughter that no apology could return. And yet, Sarah reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You're here now. Don't waste this chance." The words struck him harder than any bullet ever had. As weeks turned into months, Sarah slowly began to include him in her life. She invited him to meet her fiancé. She brought him along when house hunting. She even asked him to walk her down the aisle when the time came, a request that left David sobbing into his calloused hands. Meanwhile, Ethan's recovery blossomed into a story of resilience that mirrored David's own. Though the boy's body healed slower than his spirit, his courage never faltered. He insisted on attending Valor Project events, often wheeling himself up to the podium to speak about the man who had saved his life. "He taught me," Ethan would say, his young voice filled with conviction, "that heroes don't look like you expect them to. Sometimes they're just people who refuse to walk away when it matters most." The bond between Ethan and David became something deeper than gratitude. It was friendship, almost paternal in its closeness. Richard noticed it too. One evening, after a gala event, he turned to David and said, "I've built empires, but I've never seen Ethan look up to someone the way he looks at you. Whatever else happens, you'll always have a place in this family." David, once a man who thought himself a burden to the world, now found himself embraced not only by his daughter, but also by a family that had every reason to keep him at arm's length. But not every day was triumph. Some nights, the old demons returned. He still woke drenched in sweat, haunted by memories of gunfire and the faces of men he couldn't save. Yet now, he was not alone in fighting them. Therapy, support groups, and the steady presence of Sarah and Ethan gave him tools he had never allowed himself before. Healing wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real. The true measure of his transformation came a year later, at the opening of the first Valor Project housing complex. Dozens of veterans stood in line, some weary and broken just as he once had been, waiting for keys to rooms that meant safety, dignity, and a second chance. Cameras flashed as Richard Hale cut the ribbon, but he quickly stepped aside, handing the microphone to David. David took a deep breath, looking at the rows of men and women before him. "I used to think my story ended when I lost everything," he began. "But standing here today, I realize the truth. Sometimes life gives you a second chance, not for yourself alone, but so you can help others find theirs. If you're standing here today, know this: you are not forgotten, not anymore." The crowd erupted in applause, but what mattered most to David was Sarah, standing in the front row with tears streaming down her cheeks. She clapped harder than anyone. That night, when he returned home, a modest apartment paid for not by charity, but by his own hard work, David sat quietly by the window, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. For the first time in decades, the silence no longer felt suffocating. It felt peaceful. His life had been a long road of loss, shame, and invisibility. But now, it was a road of redemption. He had not only saved a boy's life, he had saved his own. And though scars still marked his soul, they no longer defined him. David Lawson was no longer the forgotten soldier. He was a father, a friend, a builder of futures, and a man finally at peace with the world and with himself. Years later, when people spoke about David Lawson, they didn't describe him as the homeless veteran. They didn't reduce him to the man who had once wandered alleys with a torn coat and empty pockets. Instead, they remembered him as the man who stood up when no one else did, the man who saved a boy, rebuilt his family, and in doing so, changed the lives of countless forgotten heroes. The Valor Project grew beyond anything Richard Hale had envisioned. What started as a single initiative in one city became a nationwide movement. Shelters expanded into permanent housing communities. Job training programs blossomed, pairing veterans with mentors who understood their battles. Mental health resources reached men and women who had spent decades believing their scars made them unworthy of help. At every ribbon-cutting ceremony, at every town hall meeting, and at every gala fundraiser, David's story was told again. Not to glorify him, but to remind the world that behind every pair of weary eyes on the street was a story worth saving. For David, the legacy wasn't in the buildings or the headlines. It was in the people. Like Marcus, a veteran who had been on the verge of taking his own life before the Valor Project gave him a place to stay and a counselor to talk to. Or Janine, a single mother and former medic who had been sleeping in her car until David personally welcomed her into one of the new facilities. Or the young boy who clutched his father's hand as they received the keys to their first real apartment, whispering, "We're safe now." Every time David saw these lives change, he felt the weight of his own past grow lighter. He had once believed his story was a cautionary tale of failure. Now it had become a lifeline for others. But perhaps his greatest legacy was not the foundation, or even the lives touched by it. It was his daughter. Sarah's wedding was a turning point, a moment David had never dared to dream he would live to see. As he walked her down the aisle, every step felt like forgiveness, like a new beginning. The look in her eyes as she whispered, "I'm proud of you, Dad," was worth more than any medal he had ever received in the service. And when Sarah's first child was born, a daughter with her mother's eyes, David held her in his arms and wept. Not for the years he had lost, but for the future he had been given. To Ethan, the boy whose life he had saved, David was more than a rescuer. He became a mentor, a guide, and a second grandfather. Years later, when Ethan gave his valedictorian speech, he dedicated his success to the man who taught me that courage doesn't end on the battlefield. It begins when you refuse to give up on life. In quiet moments, David often sat in his modest living room, framed photographs covering the walls. One of Sarah smiling with her baby, one of Ethan standing tall in his graduation gown, one of the first Valor Project housing complex, filled with men and women whose eyes once mirrored his own despair, now alive with hope. He didn't need mansions, wealth, or prestige. His legacy lived in those images, in those people, in the knowledge that his pain had not been wasted. And though David never sought recognition, the world insisted on honoring him. He was invited to speak before Congress about veteran affairs. Universities gave him honorary degrees for his advocacy. His name was etched into the cornerstone of every new Valor Project building. But whenever he stood before a crowd, his words were always the same. "I was once invisible, but all it takes is one person willing to see you, to believe in you, to give you a second chance. Be that person for someone else." The applause never mattered as much as the silence that followed, the silence of people truly listening. David Lawson had lived his life in two halves, one in darkness, the other in light. And the bridge between them was not luck or charity, it was courage, compassion, and the willingness to fight for a future, even when the past tried to drag him down. That was his true legacy. Stories like David's remind us that behind every struggle lies resilience, behind every betrayal lies truth, and behind every overlooked soul lies the possibility of greatness. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, cry, or believe in hope again, then join us at Truth Unraveled. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful, emotional stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit. Like this video to help spread David's message of resilience and redemption. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that no one is ever truly forgotten. Because here at Truth Unraveled, we believe that the most overlooked stories are often the ones that change the world.